Hey guys, tonight we begin with the extraordinary culinary spectrum of medieval Ireland. A land where one man's dinner was boiled oats, and the other's was roast swan stuffed with almond cream and social hierarchy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So you wake up in a damp one-room hut made of wattle and daub. The roof leaks when it rains, which is always, and the air smells faintly of livestock and despair. It's breakfast time, if you're lucky. If not, it's still breakfast time, just with a more existential twist. Your options? Oats, sometimes barley, always boiled. Occasionally, if the gods are smiling and the cow didn't die last winter, you might stir in a splash of milk or a pat of butter. But mostly, it's gruel, a kind of edible beige paste with the consistency of baby food and the excitement of a tax form. Medieval Irish porridge wasn't served in cute ceramic bowls with berry garnishes. It came in wooden troughs, shared communally. This was efficient, and also a great way to get extremely familiar with your cousin's dental hygiene, or lack thereof. Salt was added, when available, which was about as often as sunlight. Sugar hadn't arrived in Ireland yet, and honey was rare and usually reserved for people who owned things like land, weapons, or functioning shoes. So flavour-wise, the goal was not painful. Now let's talk texture. This wasn't the creamy oatmeal of modern breakfast cafes. This was somewhere between mortar and medieval regret. If you dropped your bowl, it could crack the floor, or bounce, depending on how long it had been sitting. And yet, people survived on it, because they had to. Oats grew well in Ireland's damp climate, didn't need fancy tools, and could be stored without much fuss. For peasants, porridge was the cornerstone of life, literally. They probably used leftover porridge as building material. Interestingly, porridge wasn't just a food, it could be weaponized. A particularly bad batch might be hurled at invading Normans or used to plug gaps in a leaking roof. Versatility was key in the 9th century. After a soul-crushing bowl of porridge, what's next on the menu? Bread. Not the fluffy, crusty kind that comes in linen baskets at French cafes. No, we're talking flatbread. Earthy, dense, mildly chewy, and just rustic enough to remind you that civilization is optional. Irish flatbread was the people's carb. Made from whatever grain was on hand, oats, barley, sometimes wheat if you were posh, and usually baked over a stone or griddle. It was Stone Age chic meets early medieval budget constraints. The dough had 2 ingredients, flour and water. Optional luxury items included salt, butter, or a slight sense of optimism. You kneaded it by hand, shaped it into rounds, and slapped it onto a flagstone by the hearth, or onto a griddle pan called a lozat, heated by a fire that, for legal reasons, we'll pretend didn't fill the house with smoke and ash. And if you're wondering, did they have ovens? Technically, yes. Clay beehive ovens existed in some settlements, but for the average peasant, baking was more of a performance art involving hot rocks, turf fires, and the occasional accidental toe scorching. Flatbread was versatile. You could eat it plain. You could tear it up and dunk it in broth. You could use it to scoop food, wrap cheese, or silence a complaining child. It was a plate, a utensil, and a mild choking hazard, all in one. But let's not romanticize it too much. These were not puffy naan or pita breads. These were survival slabs. Leftover bread was dried and rehydrated as needed, or fed to pigs. Sometimes it was so hard, you could sharpen it and use it as a tool. That's probably not historically accurate, but honestly it feels spiritually true. Of course, in noble households, bread went up market. Wheat became more common, and sometimes they even sieved the flour, a radical act of refinement. But even kings didn't have sourdough starters bubbling on the window ledge. That trend wouldn't arrive for several centuries, along with the collective panic over how to keep them alive. In the end, Irish flatbread was the edible equivalent of a dependable friend, sturdy, honest, a little coarse, and always there when you needed it, unless the cows had eaten the flour again. If porridge was the foundation of the Irish medieval diet, dairy was the cement holding the entire operation together. White, fatty, slightly sour cement. Ireland, blessed with endless rain and lush grass, quickly figured out that if you feed all that to a cow, something magical happens. Milk. And if you're really brave and let that milk sit around for a bit, you get an entire culinary genre. Butter, buttermilk, curds, cheese, and something worryingly referred to as sour milk, which, in fairness, is exactly what it sounds like. Let's begin with the star of the show, butter. This wasn't just food, this was wealth. A good churn of golden butter was as much a currency as silver, and probably more delicious. Butter was stored in wooden containers, buried in bogs to preserve it, and then, months or even years later, dug up and eaten, presumably with a lot of confidence and very little sniffing. The medieval Irish were so serious about dairy, they literally named their legal fines in terms of how much butter you owed someone. Stole a sheep? 2 tubs of butter. Insulted a chieftain? That'll be 4 tubs and a deeply sincere apology. Milk, by itself, wasn't just for drinking. It was often fermented into sour milk or whey, because refrigeration was a fantasy, and raw milk turns into a biology experiment faster than you can say dysentery. Still, it was packed with calories and protein, and if you weren't lactose intolerant, it was basically liquid survival. Cheese existed, but don't picture the artisan wheels from a modern deli. Picture a greyish, slightly squishy block, probably made by accident when someone forgot their curds on a shelf. You didn't nibble it with crackers, you gnawed at it like it owed you rent. Even cream made an appearance, especially in noble homes. It could be poured over berries, dolloped onto bread, or hoarded jealously by monks who knew that nothing said piety like full-fat dairy indulgence. Dairy was available across the classes, though naturally, wealth meant more cows, and more cows meant more dairy. So while peasants scraped bowls of buttermilk, nobles floated their bread in cream like they were bathing in culinary superiority. In medieval Ireland, you weren't just what you ate, you were what you milked. Water, essential for life, and in medieval Ireland, also essential for getting violently ill. Hence, the unofficial nationwide programme of just not drinking it unless you were really desperate, or possessed the constitution of a particularly reckless goat. The average peasant didn't have access to what modern people call safe drinking water. Their local stream doubled as a drinking source, a laundry spot, and occasionally a livestock toilet. The only thing it didn't do was apologise. And while boiling could kill pathogens, firewood wasn't free, and effort was a limited resource. So most people skipped the purification step and moved straight to anything else. Enter milk, buttermilk, whey, and the all-time favourite, ale. Yes, even children drank it. No, not because they had terrible parents, but because slightly fermented grain juice was safer than trusting the puddle near your pigsty. This ale wasn't the kind of drink that turns you into an amateur bard after 2 pints. It was weak, low in alcohol, and drunk by the bucket. It was liquid bread, without the bread part. Peasants brewed it in small batches with barley, water, and sheer necessity. Nobles had it brewed in vast quantities, with added herbs or honey if they felt fancy, or just bored. Whey, the sour byproduct of cheese making, was also popular, a kind of proto-energy drink, minus the branding and FDA approval. It was cloudy, acidic, and perfect for staying hydrated while contemplating the futility of medieval life. Even mead made appearances, honey wine for the upper classes, because nothing says, "I'm better than you," like sipping your hydration from a goblet while the peasants drink tangy cheese water out of a gourd. To be clear, people did drink water, just carefully, from running springs, preferably up mountain from the nearest cow, and only if no one saw you doing it, lest they assume you'd given up on life entirely. And so, what started as a survival strategy became a cultural habit. Don't drink the water, ever. An idea so strong, it would echo into modern tourist advice for centuries to come. In medieval Ireland, hydration was an art, one that required ingenuity, fermentation, and the constant avoidance of dysentery. In medieval Ireland, meat wasn't something you just ate. It was something you waited for, like spring, or justice, or your neighbour to finally admit that their goat was eating your cabbages. And when it came to protein, pork was king. Cows were too valuable for their milk and status. Chickens were inconsistent. Fish were seasonal and came with church-mandated guilt. But the pig, ah yes, the humble, oinking lard bank on legs. Pigs were the medieval equivalent of a fridge that refilled itself. You could feed them leftovers, acorns, turnip peels, and questionable moral decisions. They'd eat it all and turn it into delicious future bacon. But here's the catch. You didn't just slaughter a pig casually. You waited and waited until winter. Because once that pig was down, it was go time. Meat had to be preserved, fast, salted, smoked, dried, and prayed over. There were no freezers, no vacuum-sealed Tupperware, and no margin for error. That pig had to feed a household for weeks, or months, if rationed correctly, and you didn't have too many freeloading cousins. The lucky bits, belly, ham, jowls, were smoked. The unlucky bits, feet, ears, kidneys, snout, were boiled or shoved into blood puddings and sausages, lovingly known as everything but the squeal. Waste not, want not. Especially when your only alternative protein was lentils and you didn't grow lentils. Bacon fat was saved for cooking, oiling pans, waterproofing boots, and occasionally styling your hair if you were very brave and very single. Now, noble households had more consistent meat access. They had forests for wild game, servants to pluck poultry, and entire smokehouses filled with salted pork slabs. Meanwhile, peasants stared at the pig all summer like it was a living ham, waiting for the day they could transform it from pet to pantry. It's worth noting that livestock theft was a serious crime in medieval Ireland. Steal a pig, and you weren't just committing a crime. You were stealing months of planned protein, future stews, and entire winter meal schedules. That's basically medieval terrorism. In short, when the pig finally died, it was a culinary festival, a logistical operation, and a meat-fueled emotional roller coaster. And yes, the neighbours could smell it. And yes, they were jealous. In the medieval Irish diet, vegetables weren't trendy. They didn't come spiralised, roasted with paprika, or stacked in colourful Instagram bowls. No, vegetables were mandatory, in the same way gravity and taxes are, unavoidable, occasionally unpleasant, and no one really wants to talk about them over dinner. Now, before you picture overflowing farmers' markets with heirloom tomatoes and smug kale, remember, this was Ireland, in the Middle Ages. You grew what didn't die. That meant cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, and if you were feeling adventurous, wild garlic or something that may or may not have been poisonous. The local rule of thumb: if it kills the goat, don't eat it. Cabbage was practically a national identity. It was boiled, stewed, or boiled again, until it achieved the consistency of wet cloth and the smell of surrender. But it filled stomachs and grew easily in soggy soil, which made it a favourite among peasants and anyone who valued survival over flavour. Leeks and onions were the medieval Irish aromatics. Not that they were used to build complex flavour profiles. No, they were just cheap, pungent, and available, which made them ideal soup fillers and enemy repellents. And then there were the root vegetables, namely turnips and parsnips, also known as potatoes before potatoes. These humble roots were roasted, mashed, boiled, or left in a corner until someone remembered to eat them. They weren't exciting, but they were reliable, like that cousin who shows up to every wedding but never says anything. Interestingly, vegetables were eaten across classes. Even kings gnawed on leeks, albeit more politely and possibly with wine. Monastic gardens were full of leafy greens, grown by men who had taken vows of poverty and presumably anti-seasoning. Still, vegetables came with danger. Without refrigeration, improper storage could lead to spoilage, rot, and unexpected bowel pilgrimages. Peasants learned quickly to cook everything within an inch of its life, not to enhance the flavour, but to murder the microbes. So no, vegetables weren't optional. They were the bulk, the ballast, the roughage that stood between you and starvation. And while no one carved a turnip to celebrate a feast, it was always there, stoic, damp, judging you from the stew pot. Today, foraging is something hipsters do on Instagram with baskets and hashtags. In medieval Ireland, it was what you did when your garden failed, your pig was still alive, and you had too much pride to steal from your neighbour. Foraging wasn't cute. It was a full-time gamble, part botany, part desperation, part praying you didn't just feed your family something mildly hallucinogenic. People roamed hedgerows and woodlands with the blank-eyed intensity of someone trying to find both dinner and purpose. Top on the edible list, berries. Bilberries, elderberries, blackberries, all sweet, all seasonal, and all fiercely contested by wildlife, other peasants, and that one smug monk who always knew the good spots. They were eaten fresh, dried for later, or crushed into crude jams that tasted like fruit and medieval poverty. Then came the wild greens, nettles, sorrel, wild garlic, and dandelion leaves. These weren't served on artisanal stoneware. They were boiled, slapped into stews, or chewed raw while muttering about hunger and fate. If it had leaves and didn't bite first, someone probably tried it. Mushrooms, of course, were the Russian roulette of foraging. Unless you had a wise elder, or a very brave guinea pig, picking the wrong cap could mean visions of Celtic gods followed by death or worse. 2 days of regretting your choices while lying in a ditch. Hazelnuts and acorns were gathered too. Hazelnuts were a treat if you could beat the squirrels. Acorns required soaking and leaching to be edible, which involved labour, so they were reserved for moments of real crisis, like famine or hosting in-laws. Even seaweed made its way into Irish diets, particularly along the coast. Rich in minerals, technically a vegetable, and most importantly, free. Coastal dwellers collected dulse and laver, dried them, and pretended they liked the taste. Foraging also taught you how to look busy while avoiding farm chores. I'm gathering herbs, often translated to, I'm hiding from Aunt Maeve and her cabbage assignment. Ultimately, foraging in medieval Ireland was not about connecting with nature. It was about not dying. It was unpredictable, often risky, but occasionally rewarding. Kind of like marriage, but with more moss. And yes, sometimes it was surprisingly tasty. But no one ever admitted that. Because if you did, you might get assigned to full-time foraging. And no one wanted that. Monks, the original meal preppers. In medieval Ireland, monasteries weren't just places for prayer, manuscript illumination, and awkward vows of silence. They were also culinary strongholds, feeding dozens of cloistered men who had taken vows of poverty, but apparently not blandness. You see, while peasants gnawed on turnips and dreamed of bacon, monks were quietly feasting in stone-walled refectories with surprisingly decent menus. Sure, they didn't eat meat. Unless you count fish, which was miraculously not meat by ecclesiastical loophole. And if you were a sick monk, which was conveniently frequent, you could be served actual meat for recovery. Recovery being medieval code for, I just really wanted sausage. Monastic meals followed strict routines. 2 meals a day, 1 in the late morning, 1 in the evening. And no snacking in between unless you were secretly growing a third arm and needed the calories. Silence was expected during meals, which meant if your lentil stew was bland, you couldn't complain out loud. Just suffer piously. The food? Better than you'd think. They had breads, often made from better grain than the peasants ever saw. They had vegetables, from carefully tended monastery gardens. They had cheese, butter, whey, ale, and honey, all made on site with monkish dedication and probably some low-level existential dread. Fish, both fresh and salted, made frequent appearances. Herring, trout, eel, and yes, even beaver. Because in a stroke of theological brilliance, beavers were considered fish due to their watery habits. Bless the monk who argued that one into canon. Fasting days? Oh, plenty of them. But medieval fasting didn't mean starvation. It meant creative menu adjustments, swapping pork for eel and calling it a spiritual triumph. Some monasteries even made luxurious fast-day stews, rich in butter and greens, because God might be watching, but he hadn't issued a spice ban. Monks also practiced hospitality. Travellers, pilgrims, and freeloading noble cousins often got a seat at the table, proving that generosity and grudging tolerance were both divine virtues. In short, monastic meals were hearty, disciplined, and a little sneaky. The monks may have been celibate and silent, but they weren't about to suffer bad food. After all, if you're giving up women, music, and personal freedom, the turnip soup better slap. If you were a noble in medieval Ireland, your life was essentially one long waiting period between banquets, occasionally interrupted by skirmishes, political marriages, and mild inbreeding. When it came to food, the nobility didn't mess around. Their meals were designed to impress, intimidate, and if possible, outshine the rival clan next door. Because what's the point of land ownership if your roasted boar isn't bigger than theirs? Let's start with the meat, because no noble feast began with a nice salad. We're talking venison, wild boar, pheasant, and beef, often roasted whole and presented like offerings to the gods of cholesterol. Venison was the jewel in the crown, not just for its flavour, but because hunting it required land, leisure, and at least 2 sycophantic relatives to chase it into a trap. There were stews, of course, because you can't serve roasted swan every day without causing a diplomatic incident with the lake spirits. Stews were where nobles tossed everything else: rabbit, onions, herbs, and enough spices to bankrupt a peasant. Cinnamon, cloves, imported pepper. Yes, because nothing says local warlord like aggressively seasoned goat. Bread came in varieties. Nobles got fine wheat bread, while the peasants were still gnawing on oatcakes resembling medieval floor tiles. These loaves were baked in ovens, an actual oven, not a hot rock, which by medieval standards was basically a Michelin star. And let's not forget the butter and cheese. Irish butter was famous, even then. So good, in fact, that some chieftains buried it in bogs to age it, and hopefully not forget where they put it. Cheese was eaten fresh or aged until it could legally be classified as a weapon. Booze, naturally. Ale, mead, and wine, imported for status, not flavour, flowed freely. The line between feast and drunken poetry competition was dangerously thin. The nobles also dabbled in desserts, mostly honey cakes, spiced fruit concoctions, and dairy-heavy sweet treats that required more cows than a monastery during Lent. In short, noble feasts were where diplomacy, gluttony, and light flexing met. They were less about nutrition, and more about making sure your enemy saw you bite into a swan leg with deliberate, unbroken eye contact. Before sugar elbowed its way into every medieval pastry like a high-maintenance guest at a feast, there was honey, golden, sticky, slightly bee-adjacent, and the undisputed ruler of medieval Irish sweetness. If you lived in early medieval Ireland and craved something sweet, your options were exactly 2: honey and finding a berry bush and pretending you liked the sour ones. Honey wasn't just a treat, it was a currency, a medicine, a flavour enhancer, and if you were ambitious, a shortcut to immortality, or at least to getting sticky hands. Monasteries, peasants, and nobles alike all valued honey. It flavoured porridges, glazed meats, fermented into mead, and was occasionally smeared on wounds. Because medieval science worked like this. Is it sticky? Then yes, it probably helps. Beehives were prized property. The Irish even had legal codes about them. Accidentally knock over your neighbour's hive and suddenly you're in a court dispute over bee manslaughter. No joke. There were fines for honey theft. That's how sugar-deprived everyone was. And the bees? Medieval Ireland treated them like royalty. They had laws protecting them, poems praising them, and monks who'd spend hours documenting their behaviour, which might have just been a clever excuse to avoid scrubbing latrines. In the kitchen, honey went everywhere. It turned gruel into a dessert and made old bread feel like a gift from the gods. It was drizzled on cheese, stirred into oatcakes, and mixed with herbs for sauces that made turnips slightly less bleak. Then there was mead, the original "oops, I fermented honey and now I'm tipsy" drink. Mead was consumed by everyone from warrior poets to sulking monks on festival days. It was a drink of celebration, ritual and occasional brawls. Even kings were obsessed. Some early Irish rulers demanded beekeeping as part of tribute. If you couldn't send men to war, at least send a few jars of the good stuff to keep the High King's desserts buzzing. Let's talk about mead, the original liquid courage of medieval Ireland. Brewed by monks, gulped by warriors, and revered by poets who couldn't handle their cups. Mead was made by fermenting honey with water, which sounds simple until you realise it involves waiting, something medieval people were disturbingly good at. The result? A golden drink that tasted like sweet sunshine and ruined many respectable decisions. You didn't drink mead because you were thirsty. You drank it because someone declared a feast, or you just made eye contact with a bard and now it's duel by lyre time. In Irish society, mead had an almost mythical reputation. It wasn't just alcohol, it was status, ceremony, and sometimes your only friend on a cold, rainy night when the sheep judged you too harshly. The High Kings drank it from horned goblets, while lesser nobles drank it from slightly less prestigious horned goblets. Peasants? They mostly watched and regretted being born without a title. And of course, there were mead halls, medieval Ireland's answer to the nightclub. These were not quiet places for contemplation. Picture a smoky wooden hall full of bearded men trying to outboast each other, while a harpist played a tune that slowly devolved into, "Why does everyone keep singing over me?" You weren't a real king if you didn't host a mead-soaked feast where someone tried to recite their family's entire genealogy mid-burp. Poetry competitions broke out, riddles were hurled like insults, and occasionally someone would declare eternal loyalty to a potato. Mead also had spiritual cachet. Monks brewed it in monasteries under the polite fiction that it was for medicinal purposes. But if you peeked into any abbey cellar, you'd find rows of bubbling barrels, and at least one brother passed out in the corner, dreaming of bees. Flavour-wise, it ranged from cloyingly sweet to shockingly potent. You could infuse it with herbs, spices or berries, assuming you had any left after the pigs stole them. Mead was adaptable. Mead forgave you for your sins. Mead laughed with you, then made you fall face first into a peat bog. And so, in the grand buffet of Irish drinks, mead was the queen bee. Elegant, unpredictable, and slightly dangerous if you stood too quickly. If you think royal medieval banquets were elegant affairs filled with delicate finger foods and polite conversation, congratulations, you've been lied to by every fantasy novel ever written. In reality, they were chaotic, meaty marathons where flamboyance met flatulence. Irish kings didn't just eat to live, they ate to prove things: status, power, divine favour, and, occasionally, the limits of human digestion. A royal banquet wasn't just a meal, it was a ceremony, a diplomatic tool, and a 4-hour performance of chewing, belching and judging others for not having a bigger roast boar. The typical feast menu read like a love letter to cholesterol: spit-roasted venison, smoked pork, eels, salmon, stewed birds and bread, dense enough to be used in a siege. Vegetables were technically present, mostly for decoration, or as something to point at while asking for more meat. If you were lucky, someone remembered the leeks. Mead and ale flowed freely, sometimes more freely than actual clean water. Table manners were creative. Knives were shared, napkins were non-existent, and licking your fingers was a sign of either high satisfaction or low shame. Probably both. Entertainment was mandatory. A proper banquet involved bards, harpists, and someone reciting your ancestors' heroic deeds until everyone had enough mead to believe them. If you didn't hire at least one poet to sing your praises mid-feast, were you even ruling? Seating arrangements were brutally political. The closer you were to the king, the more important you were. Unless you were the king's brother, in which case you were probably seated far away for safety reasons. Jealous cousins. In the corner. That one monk who drinks too fast. By the fire pit, where he can pass out discreetly. And then came the leftovers, or as peasants called them, our entire meal. Kings had stewards whose sole job was to gather the scraps, which were often better than anything a commoner would eat all year. Yes, this system was exploitative, but also very efficient at clearing tables. By the end of the night, you were full, woozy, and several political alliances had shifted depending on who shared their pudding. Welcome to medieval diplomacy, fueled by boar, barley, and bravado. When it came to cooking in medieval Ireland, the motto was simple. If in doubt, boil it, and if not in doubt, still boil it. Frying was for the rich, baking was for monasteries. Boiling, that was for everyone, every day, for every meal, forever. The medieval Irish cauldron was basically the instant pot of its day, minus the pressure control, stainless steel, or instructions. You just tossed everything in. Meat, grains, herbs, sometimes a root you hoped wasn't poisonous, and prayed the fire would do the rest. Then you stirred it until it resembled food, or at least something warm and vaguely edible. If you were a peasant, your go-to cooking method involved hanging this pot over a fire in the middle of a smoke-filled house with no chimney. You boiled your meal. You inhaled your meal. You wore your meal. Multi-sensory cuisine, as modern chefs might say. Stews were the king of the kitchen. You could stretch a little meat across many mouths, or none, if the meat had mysteriously disappeared in the night, probably into your cousin's stew pot next door. Oats, barley, cabbage, wild herbs, all took a turn in the pot. If you were fancy, you added leeks. If you were cursed, someone threw in nettle and told you it was medicinal. Roasting was reserved for the nobility or people who had enough firewood and meat to show off. And yes, roasting a full animal did impress the neighbours, almost as much as not burning your thatched roof down in the process. Some cooking involved hot stones, a prehistoric method that somehow lingered for centuries because boiling wasn't quite exciting enough. You'd heat stones in the fire and drop them into a pit of water until it boiled. Then you'd toss in your food and realise you just invented the world's first hot tub soup. Baking was rare and required an oven, so guess what? Monasteries hoarded that technology. They produced dense breads that doubled as dinner and doorstops. Peasants made griddle cakes on flat stones and called it bread. Desperate times, desperate carbs. So yes, medieval Irish cooking had its limitations, but it also had a certain genius. One pot, one fire, one goal. Don't die. If you thought medieval Ireland was just a chaotic mix of clans, cattle raids, and people boiling everything that moved, you'd be mostly correct. But what often gets overlooked is the fact that they had laws about food, and they took them quite seriously. Enter the Brehon Laws, a medieval Irish legal system so comprehensive it had rules for everything from land disputes to bee theft. And yes, even who got fed, what they were fed, and how often. You weren't just a peasant. You were a peasant with legal dietary rights. Sort of. For example, poets, the influencers of their day, were entitled to specific foods based on their rank. A top-tier poet, called an ollum, could legally demand a seat at the chieftain's table and feast on pork, ale, and bread until his verses rhymed again. Meanwhile, a lowly beginner bard might just get porridge and a raised eyebrow. Hospitallers, or briúg, had an even stranger burden. They were legally required to keep their homes stocked with food at all times, just in case travellers, vagrants, or cousins, twice removed, showed up. It wasn't just hospitality. It was legally mandated overfeeding. Even cattle were tied into food law. If someone stole your cow, which was basically your fridge on legs, there were precise compensation rates. Not just give it back, but give back the cow, the calf, a meal, and possibly an apology verse in bad old Irish. There were laws about fasting too. If a person wanted to protest mistreatment, they could sit and fast in front of the offender's house. The idea was that the social shame of letting someone starve on your doorstep would make you settle the dispute. Today, we call that silent treatment. Back then it was state-sanctioned guilt-tripping. but perhaps the most charming law? A beekeeper had to share every third jar of honey with his neighbours, because apparently bee zoning disputes were a thing. If your bees wandered onto someone else's flowers, you owed them a slice of the honey pie. Literally. If you thought the medieval Irish table died out with the last bard and the final boiled oat, think again. The spirit of that table, equal parts hunger, hospitality, and stubborn practicality, still simmers in the Irish kitchen today. It's just traded the open hearth for an electric hob and swapped pig's blood for black pudding with a side of denial. For one, the Irish obsession with bread didn't end with oatcakes and griddle stones. Enter soda bread, the spiritual descendant of whatever flour you can find and hope it rises. It's dense, it's crumbly, it's been known to cause dental flashbacks. But it's ours, and you'll eat it even if you have to butter it into submission. Then there's the potato, often mistaken as the original Irish food group. Ironically, it didn't even arrive until the 16th century, but it was adopted with such desperate enthusiasm you'd think St. Patrick planted it himself. It filled the role left by barley, turnips, and boiled anything. And while it later became a national tragedy, it also became a national identity. Mash it, fry it, bake it, just never disrespect it. Hospitality, too, remains stubbornly alive. The medieval requirement to feed your guests, still very much law, only now enforced by your nan with tea, scones, and thinly veiled guilt. Refusing seconds, treason, thirds, expected. Irish dairy, once a sign of wealth and political clout, is now quietly responsible for half the world's butter consumption and the other half's cholesterol. The same land that gave us fermented mare's milk now gives us Kerrygold. Progress. Even food laws haven't quite vanished. Modern Ireland may not fine you for bee mismanagement anymore, but try leaving your neighbour's dinner invitation unanswered and see what happens to your reputation at the parish bake sale. In the end, the legacy of the Irish table isn't just in recipes, it's in resilience, resourcefulness, and relentless feeding. Medieval Ireland made cuisine out of chaos, hospitality out of obligation, and flavour out of, well, not always. But they tried. So next time you slice soda bread, stir stew, or burn a pancake while trying to channel your inner monk, remember, you're not just cooking. You're participating in a 1,000-year-old legal, cultural, and culinary survival strategy. When most people think of Vikings, they picture horned helmet raiders storming monasteries and villages, swords flashing in the dawn. But that's only part of the story. Beneath the ferocity was something far more calculated, a trading empire that stretched across continents. The Vikings were not only warriors, they were merchants, navigators, and cultural connectors who transformed Europe through commerce. From the rocky coastlines of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, Viking longships carried goods that few others could source. Think of pelts from the cold northern forests, luxurious furs of fox, sable, and beaver that became the winter armour of European nobility. Walrus ivory, carved from Arctic tusks, was prized in workshops from England to Constantinople, used to make chess pieces, crucifixes, and intricate ornaments. And then there was amber, golden fossilized resin washed up on the Baltic shores. In an age where glittering gems symbolized divine power, amber was more than pretty jewelry. It was believed to hold magical properties, making it one of the Vikings' most marketable treasures. What made these goods so valuable was rarity. Kings and bishops in distant lands didn't have access to the deep forests of Scandinavia or the ice-crusted seas of the north. The Vikings became middlemen, supplying the luxuries that fueled status and authority. Their ships weren't always loaded with plunder, but with carefully stacked cargo, protected as fiercely as gold. To make these trades possible, the Vikings had to become diplomats as much as fighters. They struck agreements with foreign rulers, negotiated tolls to pass through rivers, and even married into foreign families to secure alliances. Where brute force opened doors, diplomacy kept them open. This was the other side of the Viking world, a network of markets and fairs where Norse merchants haggled, exchanged, and learned. Their commercial routes linked them not just to nearby neighbours, but to the beating economic heart of medieval Eurasia. For the Vikings, trade wasn't simply survival, it was power. Every amber bead and ivory carving transported across Europe became a silent testament that these barbarians were also master traders. By the time Viking merchants set their sights beyond the Baltic, they weren't just carrying goods, they were carrying influence. If Scandinavia was the starting point, the Baltic Sea was the launch pad. This inland sea, ringed by forests, icy rivers, and fertile shores, became the Vikings' first great marketplace. From Denmark's Jutland Peninsula to the Gulf of Finland, every coastal settlement could be tapped, and the Baltic offered both riches and risks. The goods flowing through this region were as diverse as its people. From the Finns came squirrel and marten pelts, small but prized in Western Europe. From the Slavic tribes came wax and honey, commodities essential for candles and mead. Timber, salt, and iron ore also crossed the waters, making the Baltic not just a hub for luxuries, but also for the practical resources that fueled medieval economies. The Vikings didn't just buy and sell these goods, they taxed, controlled, and sometimes outright seized them, inserting themselves as gatekeepers of the trade. Amber, however, remained the jewel of the Baltic. Known since Roman times as the gold of the north, it was collected along the shores of modern-day Poland and Lithuania. Merchants carried it in sacks across stormy seas, and Viking markets displayed it in beads, amulets, and ornaments. For warriors and nobles across Europe, amber wasn't only decorative, it was believed to ward off evil and cure illness. This aura of mysticism made it an item almost as valuable as silver. To secure these networks, the Vikings built fortified trading posts at key locations. Hedeby in modern Germany and Birka in Sweden became thriving emporiums, buzzing with sailors, smiths, and foreign traders. Archaeology has revealed streets lined with workshops, docks packed with longships, and warehouses bursting with imported goods. At these crossroads, Norsemen rubbed shoulders with Saxons, Slavs, and even Arabs, turning what might seem like remote northern waters into one of the busiest highways of the Middle Ages. But the Baltic wasn't always calm. Piracy was rampant, and rival tribes challenged Viking dominance. The same warriors who traded could, on another day, raid. This dual identity, merchant and marauder, was what made the Vikings so adaptable. They could offer peaceful trade to one community while burning another to the ground. To the Vikings, it wasn't contradiction, it was business. By mastering the Baltic crossroads, the Norse secured wealth and experience. This was their apprenticeship in global trade. From here, the rivers of Eastern Europe beckoned, and beyond them lay the riches of Byzantium and the Caliphate, worlds waiting for Viking sails to appear on the horizon. Once the Vikings had mastered the Baltic, they turned their attention inland, following the veins of water that cut through Eastern Europe. The great rivers, Neva, Volkhov, Dnieper, and Volga, were not just waterways, they were highways into new markets. Long ships, designed with shallow keels, could slip from sea into river and glide deep into the continent, linking the icy Baltic to the Black and Caspian seas. This opened a corridor into the lands that would one day become Russia and Ukraine. The Norsemen who ventured here became known as the Varangians, a name that carried both fear and respect. They founded trading settlements that doubled as fortresses, most famously Novgorod and later Kiev. These outposts weren't just camps. They were the nuclei of entire political entities, where Norse rulers, known as the Rus, blended with local Slavic populations. From these bases, Viking merchants funneled goods southward and funneled wealth back north. What exactly moved along these rivers? From the north came furs and amber, staples of the Viking economy. From the forests and fields of the Slavs came honey, wax, and grain. But the most controversial cargo was human. Slaves, captured in raids or taken as tribute, were shipped in chains downriver, destined for markets in Byzantium or the Islamic world. For the Vikings, slave trading wasn't an accident of war. It was a structured, profitable enterprise that underpinned their eastern ventures. These routes were dangerous. Rapids along the Dnieper forced merchants to haul ships overland, dragging them across rocky ground while keeping watch for ambushes. Bandits, rival tribes, and political rivals lurked at every bend in the river. Yet the risks were worth it. Each successful journey could mean bolts of silk from Byzantium, silver coins from the Caliphate, or fine weapons forged in foreign lands. Archaeological finds showed just how far Viking networks stretched. In Scandinavian graves, silks woven in Persia have been uncovered, along with coins minted in Baghdad. To the Norse, these treasures weren't just proof of wealth. They were symbols of prestige, reminders that their reach extended far beyond the cold fjords of home. By navigating the rivers into Russia, the Vikings transformed themselves into more than coastal traders. They became the bridge between Europe and Asia, carving out routes that would define Eastern Europe's political and cultural future. Kiev and Novgorod weren't just waypoints. They were the birthplaces of kingdoms shaped by Viking ambition. If the rivers of Russia were arteries, then Byzantium was the beating heart they pumped toward. The city of Constantinople, known to the Vikings as Miklagard, the great city, was the ultimate prize. No other medieval capital dazzled with such wealth. Its markets overflowed with silk, spices, jewels and perfumes. Its walls glittered with mosaics. Its harbour bristled with ships from every corner of the known world. For Viking merchants, reaching Byzantium was like stepping into another universe, where gold was not myth, but currency, and luxury was everyday life. The journey south was punishing. The Dnieper River carried the Varangians through Slavic territories, down treacherous rapids, and across hostile tribal lands. At points, merchants had to portage their ships, dragging them across land to bypass impassable waters, all while keeping eyes sharp for ambushes. But once the Golden Horn of Constantinople came into view, every blister and scar was worth it. Byzantine officials, wary of barbarian invaders, didn't just fling open the gates. Trade was carefully regulated. Foreigners could only dock in designated harbours, sell goods in restricted markets, and were subject to Byzantine taxes. Yet the Vikings accepted these terms because the payoff was immense. In exchange for their northern wares, furs, wax, honey, and especially slaves, they received silk robes, embroidered garments, fine wine, and coins of pure gold. For warriors accustomed to rough wool and mead, such luxuries were transformative. These goods became status symbols back home, proof that a man had seen Miklagard with his own eyes. It wasn't only goods that flowed. Cultural exchanges reshaped both worlds. Norse sagas speak of Constantinople's massive churches and the grandeur of the Hagia Sophia, inspiring awe in visitors. Many Varangians too were recruited into Byzantine service as mercenaries, forming the legendary Varangian Guard, an elite unit of axe-wielding bodyguards who protected the emperor himself. Serving in Byzantium meant silver-filled purses, but it also meant honour and prestige upon returning north. The road to Byzantium symbolised more than commerce. It was the Vikings' entrance into global politics. Through trade and service, they became entwined with one of the most sophisticated empires of the medieval world, and every bolt of silk carried home, every Byzantine coin buried in a Scandinavian hoard, whispered of a truth. The Vikings were not isolated raiders on Europe's fringes. They were international players in the drama of medieval trade. While Byzantium dazzled with silk and gold, another world beckoned further east, the Islamic Caliphate. From Baghdad to Samarkand, the Muslim world pulsed with wealth, culture, and trade networks that stretched from India to North Africa. For Viking merchants, reaching this sphere meant access to the one thing they craved above all else: silver. Silver wasn't just a luxury, it was the lifeblood of Viking commerce. In Scandinavia, coins weren't used in the same way as in the markets of Baghdad or Cordoba. Instead, silver was weighed, cut, and hoarded. A necklace of twisted silver rings, called hacksilver, could be clipped apart to pay for goods or services. Viking society measured wealth by how much silver one possessed, and no region in the world produced more of it in the 9th and 10th centuries than the Caliphate. The Volga River provided the key. Sailing from the Baltic, Norse traders followed the waterways through what is now Russia, linking up with Islamic merchants in the Caspian Basin. In exchange for northern furs, honey, and grimly slaves, the Vikings received dirhams, silver coins minted in cities like Baghdad and Samarra. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of thousands of these coins buried in Scandinavian hoards, proof of just how deeply the Caliphate's silver fueled the Viking economy. Some hoards even contain coins altered into jewellery, their Arabic inscriptions still visible centuries later. These journeys weren't simple trading missions. They were perilous expeditions through contested territories, often requiring tribute to local tribes or alliances with Slavic chieftains. Caravans of captives marched alongside merchants, bound for markets in Islamic lands where demand for slaves was insatiable. To the Vikings, this human trade was not a shameful secret, but an accepted cornerstone of their wealth. Yet the Caliphate offered more than coins. Textiles, spices, glassware, and advanced craftsmanship also found their way north. A Viking chieftain's hall could feature silk cushions woven in Persia or glassware blown in the Levant. These objects were more than ornaments. They were statements of prestige, markers of a connection to distant, sophisticated civilizations. Silver from the Caliphate poured into Viking hands, transforming their society. It funded expeditions, built alliances, and allowed ambitious leaders to reward their followers with glittering wealth. Without this eastern river of silver, the Viking Age might have been far shorter. The flow of dirhams tied the fate of northern Europe to the distant courts of Baghdad, weaving the Norse into a global economy they could never have imagined when they first set sail. Trade routes alone weren't enough to sustain Viking wealth. Goods needed hubs, places where merchants could gather, haggle and store cargo before setting sail again. From Scandinavia to Eastern Europe, the Vikings established a network of bustling trading towns, each one a mix of marketplace, fortress, and cultural crossroads. Take Hedeby, located near modern-day Schleswig in northern Germany. This settlement sat at the perfect choke point between the North Sea and the Baltic, allowing the Vikings to control overland portages and sea lanes alike. Archaeological excavations reveal streets lined with workshops, blacksmiths hammering iron, jewelers working amber, and traders dealing in everything from livestock to silk. Hedeby wasn't just a Viking town. It was a global bazaar where Franks, Saxons, and Slavs rubbed shoulders with Norsemen. Further east, Birka in Sweden played a similar role. Strategically placed on Lake Mälaren, it became a gateway for furs and amber moving south. Excavations at Birka have uncovered Arabic coins, Byzantine silks, and weapons forged far from Scandinavia, evidence that this remote town was plugged into the wider world. Birka also served as a testing ground for early urban life in Scandinavia. Wooden streets, warehouses and trading docks gave Vikings their first taste of city life, long before the rise of medieval towns like Stockholm or Oslo. In Eastern Europe, towns such as Novgorod and Kiev grew from trading posts into political power centres. Originally fortified camps, they expanded into thriving cities, mixing Norse, Slavic and Byzantine influences. Kiev especially became the linchpin of the Dnieper trade, controlling the flow of goods and tribute down to Constantinople. These markets were not static. They were engines of transformation, turning Viking raiders into rulers and traders into princes. Life in these towns revolved around more than trade. Markets drew entertainers, craftsmen, and even missionaries. Hedeby and Birka both show evidence of Christian influence arriving via merchants, centuries before conversion swept Scandinavia. A Viking market wasn't just about coins changing hands. It was where cultures collided, where stories of distant lands were told, and where a peasant might glimpse luxuries otherwise reserved for kings. These trading towns were vital stepping stones in the Viking commercial empire. Without them, long-distance routes would have crumbled under their own weight. They provided stability, warehouses for goods, and a sense of permanence in a world often defined by movement. For the Vikings, markets weren't just places of business. They were symbols of power, prestige, and the growing sophistication of Norse society. behind the glitter of silver and silk, one commodity fueled Viking trade more than any other: human beings. The Norse called them thralls, and they were captured in raids, bought from neighbouring tribes, or taken as tribute. While modern eyes see this as one of the darkest aspects of Viking commerce, in the medieval world it was brutally normal and immensely profitable. From the earliest raids on Anglo-Saxon England to campaigns deep into Slavic lands, Viking longships often returned not just with gold or livestock, but with men, women and children bound in chains. These captives were forced into two fates. Some remained in Scandinavia as household servants, field labourers or concubines. Others were transported along the great rivers and seas, destined for markets in Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate, where demand for slaves was relentless. The mechanics of this trade were stark. A raid might devastate a village, after which survivors were rounded up and marched to the nearest Viking market town. From Hedeby to Kiev, traders organised sales where thralls were exchanged for silver, weapons, or foreign luxuries. Archaeological evidence from Dublin, a Viking-founded city, suggests it became one of the largest slave markets in Europe, its streets echoing with the cries of captives awaiting shipment abroad. In the east, slaves were among the most valuable exports. Byzantine aristocrats employed them as servants and soldiers, while in the Caliphate, slaves filled roles from domestic workers to harem attendants, and even soldiers in elite guard units. For Viking merchants, the human trade was a steady and lucrative source of wealth, far more reliable than sporadic raids or seasonal fur hunts. Yet this trade wasn't without impact at home. The influx of slaves allowed Viking chieftains to expand their estates, increasing agricultural production and consolidating their power. A wealthy household might include dozens of thralls, their labour freeing free-born men for warfare or trade. Over time, this reliance on unfree labour shaped Scandinavian society itself, creating stark divisions between the wealthy elite and those bound in servitude. The slave trade reveals the duality of the Vikings, adventurous explorers and ruthless profiteers. While their sagas celebrate voyages and battles, the silent backbone of their economy was this grim commerce. Silver hoards buried in Scandinavian soil, Byzantine silks draped over chieftains' shoulders. Many were purchased at the cost of human freedom. For the Vikings, the slave trade was not an unfortunate byproduct of conquest. It was business as usual, and it tied their world to a global system where people, tragically, were currency. Every trade route is more than the movement of goods. It is the movement of ideas, languages, and traditions. For the Vikings, commerce was never a one-way street. Each time a longship docked in a foreign harbour, it carried not only furs and amber, but also curiosity. And every time it returned, it brought back fragments of the cultures it touched. From Byzantium, Norse travellers returned with tales of towering churches, glittering mosaics, and processions so magnificent they seemed almost divine. Some brought home crosses and icons, the first seeds of Christianity that would eventually take root in Scandinavia. Others carried back new shipbuilding techniques or architectural styles, weaving foreign craftsmanship into local traditions. Archaeologists have found silk garments in Viking graves, worn alongside traditional wool tunics, symbols of both status and the blending of worlds. The Caliphate too left its mark. Arabic coins not only enriched Viking hoards, but also carried inscriptions that fascinated the Norse. Some were bent into pendants, worn as amulets, suggesting that the spiritual weight of Islam's calligraphy resonated even among those who did not understand it. Glassware, spices, and fine steel entered Viking households, broadening their diets and reshaping their sense of luxury. Cultural exchange worked both ways. Viking traders and mercenaries introduced Scandinavia's rugged artistry abroad. Norse jewellery and weapon designs travelled far, influencing the decorative motifs of Eastern Europe. In Constantinople, the Varangian Guard's reputation for loyalty and ferocity spread Viking identity deep into Byzantine culture. To see a towering blonde axe-wielder guarding the emperor became a symbol of both security and barbarian mystique. Even language bore the marks of these encounters. Loanwords filtered into Old Norse, reflecting new goods and ideas. Likewise, Slavic and Greek dialects absorbed hints of Viking speech. These exchanges stitched together distant communities into a shared fabric of medieval connectivity. Back home, these influences reshaped Norse society. Viking chieftains displayed foreign luxuries as symbols of authority. Rituals, clothing, and even burial customs evolved, reflecting contact with far-off civilizations. A Viking grave in Sweden might hold both a traditional sword and a silk shroud woven in the east, a fusion of identities that told the story of a world far bigger than Scandinavia's fjords. In the end, trade was more than survival, it was transformation. The Viking Age was as much about the sharing of cultures as it was about raiding and sailing. The Norse didn't just plunder the world, they became part of it, absorbing its wealth, its wisdom, and its ways. When the Viking Age gradually waned in the 11th century, longships still cut across seas, but the Norse world was changing. Kings consolidated power, Christianity spread across Scandinavia, and raiding gave way to kingdoms and states. Yet the legacy of Viking trade did not disappear. It endured in the wealth, cities, and cultural links they had created. The silver hoards buried across Sweden and Denmark stand as silent monuments to this legacy. Tens of thousands of Islamic dirhams and Byzantine coins lie beneath the soil, evidence that Scandinavia was once plugged into global economies, stretching from Baghdad to Constantinople. These coins funded the rise of powerful chieftains and later monarchs, providing the material base for the first centralized kingdoms of the north. Without the rivers of silver from the east, the emergence of medieval Denmark, Norway, and Sweden might have been delayed by centuries. Cities like Dublin, Novgorod, and Kiev also testify to the endurance of Viking trade. Founded as little more than fortified camps or markets, they blossomed into urban centres that outlived the Viking Age itself. Kiev grew into the heart of Kievan Rus, a polity that would shape the future of Russia and Ukraine. Dublin remained a thriving port city long after Viking rule faded, its streets echoing with the multicultural heritage left by Norse traders. The transformation from raiding bands to town builders was perhaps the most profound mark the Vikings left on Europe. The cultural legacy was equally strong. Scandinavian art absorbed Byzantine and Islamic motifs, blending them into new patterns that became uniquely Norse. Trade brought Christianity northward, not just through missionaries, but through merchants carrying crosses, icons, and stories. By the late 10th century, kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson used both religion and trade to consolidate power, ensuring the Viking world was forever linked to Christendom. Even today, the saga of Viking trade resonates. The image of the marauding raider often overshadows the reality of the calculating merchant, yet both identities were inseparable. The Vikings raided to acquire wealth, but they traded to sustain it. Their routes connected the frozen north to the deserts of the Middle East, binding distant worlds through rivers, seas, and shared commerce. The legacy of Viking trade lies not only in the goods they moved, but in the bridges they built. Bridges of culture, language, and power. In shaping the medieval world, the Norse proved they were not just destroyers of civilizations, but also creators of connections that stretched across continents. Step into the heart of a medieval festival, and you'd quickly realize that women were not simply background figures, they were the lifeblood of the celebration. These gatherings, whether tied to the church calendar, agricultural cycles, or community milestones, were opportunities to escape the grind of daily toil. And in nearly every corner of the fairground, women's work and presence were unmistakable. Long before the first drumbeat or church bell signalled the start of festivities, women had already been preparing. They helped brew ale in great vats, baked bread in communal ovens, and roasted meat that would later be sold at stalls. In villages, entire families often pooled resources for the feast, but it was usually women who orchestrated the logistics. Without them, the aroma of spiced pies, honey cakes, and hot stews, those scents that defined a medieval fair, simply would not have filled the air. Once the festival began, women took on visible roles in music and dance. Girls and young maidens were often the first to leap into circle dances, their songs and steps setting the pace for the revelry. Older women sometimes played instruments, tambourines, harps, or hurdy-gurdies, or led in call and response folk songs that stitched the community together. These performances weren't professional showcases, they were living traditions, with women as both guardians and transmitters of cultural memory. But women's contributions went beyond food and music. They were also central in ritual and symbolism. During harvest festivals, for example, it was common for a young woman to be chosen as the harvest queen, crowned with a wreath of grain to embody the fertility of the fields. On May Day, women led the weaving of ribbons around the maypole, embodying the renewal of life and community. Their roles often reflected broader cultural associations of women with fertility, nurture, and continuity, powerful archetypes made visible in festival spaces. Festivals also provided women with rare moments of freedom. Markets that sprang up during fairs allowed them to sell their own handiwork, textiles, herbs, dairy products, and pocket the profits. Socially, festivals offered a chance to mingle, flirt, and even court in public, something more restricted during ordinary life. In a world shaped by hierarchy and custom, the festival stage gave women space to express themselves, assert their presence, and step, however briefly, into the center of community life. In essence, medieval festivals were communal performances, and women were not just participants, but directors, weaving together food, music, ritual, and family into a spectacle that kept villages alive with meaning. Few festivals in the medieval calendar carried the same sense of joy and renewal as May Day. Falling at the turning point of spring into summer, it was a day when fields began to green, flowers burst into bloom, and life itself seemed to awaken. For women, May Day was both a chance to celebrate and to embody the season's fertility and renewal. Preparations began before dawn. Girls would gather in meadows and forests to collect blossoms, hawthorn, primrose, and wild roses, which they wove into garlands and crowns. These floral wreaths were more than decoration. They symbolized purity, vitality, and the promise of growth. When worn by maidens, they carried an added charm, a signal to the community that spring was not just a season of crops, but of courtship. Central to the celebration was the maypole, a tall wooden pole erected in the village green. Women played a crucial role in the ribbon dance, weaving bright strands around the pole in spirals and patterns while music played. The dance, often led by young women, was both playful and symbolic, an ancient ritual tied to the cycles of fertility and abundance. It was believed that the harmony of the ribbons mirrored the harmony of nature itself. Fields flourishing, livestock multiplying, families growing. May Day also brought the tradition of choosing a May Queen, almost always a young woman from the community. Crowned with flowers and seated on a makeshift throne, she became the symbolic embodiment of spring's vitality. Her role was ceremonial, but her presence carried weight. She represented not just youth and beauty, but the community's collective hope for prosperity. Songs and dances often revolved around her, and for one day, she was the axis of the celebration. Music, laughter, and food carried the festival into the evening. Women's voices led the singing of ballads, some playful, others laced with echoes of older pagan traditions. The bonfires that sometimes accompanied May Day were also spaces where women played central roles, tending the flames, tossing herbs into the fire for luck, or dancing at its edge to celebrate life renewed. For many women, May Day was more than a festival. It was one of the few days where everyday roles loosened. The boundaries of class and duty blurred in the dance and song. For a fleeting moment, women weren't simply defined as labourers, wives, or mothers. They were celebrated as the living symbols of nature's rebirth. If May Day was about the renewal of life, the harvest festivals were about survival. Everything in the medieval year hinged on whether the harvest was good, and when the fields finally yielded their bounty, villages erupted in celebration. Women were at the very heart of these festivals, shaping the rituals and embodying the community's gratitude to the land. As crops were gathered, women's work intensified. They joined men in binding sheaves of wheat, threshing grain, and storing food for the long winter. But when the harvest was complete, the heavy labour shifted into pageantry. At many festivals, the final sheaf of grain was woven into a decorative figure, sometimes called the Corn Mother or Harvest Maiden. This effigy, often crafted by women, was believed to hold the spirit of the harvest. It was carried in procession and given a place of honour at the feast, a reminder that the year's survival rested on nature's generosity. In some communities, a young woman was chosen to be the harvest queen. Crowned with a wreath of grain, she embodied fertility and abundance, standing as a living parallel to the symbolic Corn Mother. Her role was ceremonial, but also deeply meaningful. She represented the prosperity of the entire village. Songs and dances were often performed around her, and she might even lead processions to the church or the communal table. Food, naturally, dominated these celebrations. Women oversaw the preparation of communal meals, loaves baked from the first grain, roasted meats, stews and pies sweetened with honey. Ale brewed earlier in the year flowed freely. The communal feast was not just indulgence, it was reassurance, proof that hunger could be staved off for another winter. Women, who often managed household food supplies year-round, became the silent guarantors of this abundance. Music and dancing followed, with women leading circle dances and singing folk songs that often blended joy with a touch of anxiety. After all, harvest was a time of relief, but it also carried the sobering knowledge that the village was only as secure as its stored grain. Women's voices, whether in song or ritual, often echoed this balance between hope and fear, life and survival. Harvest festivals underscored women's symbolic link to fertility, the earth, and continuity. As they wove sheaves, crowned queens, and stirred pots for the communal feast, they weren't just contributing labour, they were personifying the very essence of the harvest. Without them, the celebration of plenty would have been hollow, and the rituals of gratitude incomplete. No medieval festival was complete without music, and women were often at its heart. Whether their voices rang out in choruses, their fingers plucked strings, or their feet struck the rhythm of a dance, women transformed gatherings from simple meals and markets into living celebrations. Music was both entertainment and tradition, and women carried its melodies across generations. Singing was perhaps the most accessible form of music, and it was dominated by women's voices. Village girls and matrons alike led communal songs, often in a call and response style that encouraged participation. These weren't just cheerful ditties. Many ballads contained stories of love, betrayal, or legendary heroes. In their verses, women wove together the memory of the community. Some songs, passed down orally, carried echoes of pagan rituals, while others blended Christian themes, reflecting the layered culture of the medieval world. Women also played instruments. In wealthier towns, women of status might accompany dances on the harp or lute, while in rural fairs, simpler instruments, tambourines, pipes, or hurdy-gurdies, were common. A woman striking a tambourine or beating a drum helped set the rhythm for circle dances, ensuring that even the shyest villager eventually joined in. For many communities, music was the glue that bound young and old, noble and peasant, into one shared moment of joy. Storytelling, too, often fell to women. Around festival fires or within crowded halls, they passed on folk tales that mingled humour with moral lessons. These stories might warn of spirits in the woods, praise the cleverness of a trickster maiden, or recount romances that mirrored the flirtations of the festival itself. In many villages, women were the keepers of local law, ensuring that children learned not just the practical skills of survival, but also the myths and values that gave their lives meaning. The role of women in music and storytelling was more than entertainment. It was preservation. By singing old songs or retelling traditional tales, they kept cultural memory alive in a world where books were rare and literacy limited. Festivals gave them the stage to perform, but their art was woven into daily life as well, sustaining the identity of the community. In the clamour of fiddles, drums, and voices rising under the night sky, women ensured that medieval festivals were more than feasts. They were spectacles of sound and story, binding people to one another through shared rhythm and memory. If music and dancing gave medieval festivals their rhythm, food gave them their heart. A celebration was only as memorable as the meal served, and women were the ones who transformed raw harvests into feasts that could feed entire communities. Their labour, often invisible in daily life, became the very foundation of festival abundance. Preparation began days, sometimes weeks before the festival. Women brewed ale in vast wooden vats, a process requiring not only knowledge of grains and herbs, but also patience and skill. Ale was the lifeblood of any gathering, consumed by all social classes, and its quality could make or break the celebration. At the same time, women baked bread, round loaves, flatbreads, and honeyed cakes, filling communal ovens with the smells of roasted grain and spices. Meat, a rarity in peasant households, was slaughtered and roasted, and women ensured it was seasoned, stewed, or preserved properly to stretch across large groups. At the festival itself, women often managed the food stalls. They sold pastries, cheese, and dried fish, or ladled steaming stews from great cauldrons. These stalls were more than convenience. They were opportunities for women to earn independent income, a rare chance to participate in the economic life of their village or town. Some even travelled from one festival to another, becoming semi-professional vendors in a world where most women's work was bound to the household. The feast tables themselves reflected women's orchestration. At communal banquets, long wooden trestles groaned under platters of roasted goose, pork, or venison, while bowls of pottage, a thick, hearty stew, were passed around. Women were responsible for serving, replenishing, and often for creating the smaller touches: spiced apples, honey-roasted nuts, or fragrant herbs scattered on the floor to sweeten the air. Their skills turned necessity into celebration. Feasting also carried symbolic weight. At harvest festivals, the first loaves baked from the new grain were sometimes prepared and blessed by women before being shared. In religious feasts, women helped prepare offerings or meals for the poor, weaving charity into the fabric of the celebration. Their role was not only culinary, but also spiritual, linking nourishment with ritual. For medieval women, festival kitchens and market stalls were both duty and opportunity. Their labour was central to the success of any celebration, and their ability to transform the year's produce into a feast symbolised the abundance of the community itself. Without women's hands tending fires, brewing ale and seasoning pots, festivals would have been hollow echoes, lacking the warmth and fullness that made them unforgettable. While medieval festivals carried the joy of music and food, they were rarely just about merriment. Most were tied to the religious calendar, blending Christian observances with older folk customs. Women played central roles in these rituals, sometimes visible, other times quietly woven into the background, yet always essential to the spiritual rhythm of the celebration. On feast days tied to saints, women decorated village churches with garlands of flowers, woven herbs, and candles. These decorations were not merely ornamental. They symbolized devotion, care, and the offering of beauty to the divine. Women also prepared altars and organized processions, often carrying candles or sacred relics through the village streets. In larger towns, noble women might sponsor these processions, their wealth funding the pageantry of banners, vestments, and choirs. For peasant women, even weaving garlands from the fields carried weight. It was their contribution to honouring God and sustaining communal faith. Festivals also carried traces of older, pre-Christian customs that women often preserved. During midsummer bonfires, women threw herbs into the flames, believing they offered protection from illness and misfortune. In harvest rituals, they wove the final sheaf into corn dolls or harvest mothers, symbols of fertility and abundance, which were then kept through the winter until spring planting. These rituals may have been reinterpreted under Christianity, but women's roles as guardians of seasonal cycles remained constant. In many celebrations, women embodied ritual figures: the May Queen, crowned with blossoms, or the Harvest Queen, adorned with grain, stood at the centre of ceremonies. These figures were not chosen randomly. They represented fertility, hope, and continuity. Through them, women became living symbols of the land's bounty and the community's future. Even in pilgrimages tied to festival days, women were prominent. They travelled with family or neighbours to holy shrines, sometimes leading songs along the road, other times offering hospitality to fellow pilgrims. The act of walking, praying, and singing together strengthened both faith and communal bonds, and women's participation ensured that these journeys carried both practical and spiritual nourishment. In essence, women wove religion and ritual into the fabric of medieval festivals. Their labour, voices, and symbols transformed gatherings from mere parties into sacred observances that reassured the community of divine favour. Without their touch, whether in garlands on an altar or in the presence of a crowned festival queen, the spiritual heart of these celebrations would have been incomplete. Festivals were not only moments of religious devotion or communal labour, they were also rare opportunities for personal freedom, especially for women. In the rigid structures of medieval life, where daily roles were tightly bound to household and field, festivals allowed women to step briefly outside those constraints. Music, dancing, and celebration created spaces where social rules loosened and possibilities for romance, friendship, and even rebellion emerged. Dancing was at the centre of these freedoms. Circle dances, line dances, and partner dances gave young men and women a chance to mingle under the watchful but lenient gaze of the community. For many unmarried women, this was the one time in the year where they could laugh, move, and flirt in public without scandal. Holding hands in a circle or weaving through lines to the beat of a drum created natural opportunities for eye contact and conversation. While marriages were often arranged, festivals gave space for personal choice to peek through, sometimes even sparking matches that would later be formalised by families. Courtship games added to the atmosphere. At May Day, a garland might be offered to a young woman as a token of admiration. At harvest festivals, songs with playful verses teased participants, pairing women and men in mock romances. Even the role of the May Queen or Harvest Queen often carried undertones of admiration, as the chosen young woman was celebrated not just for symbolic fertility, but also for her beauty and grace. Older women, too, found space in festivals to step outside their routines. Mothers and matrons joined the dances, sang with neighbours, and relished the chance to laugh freely. Some festivals even encouraged misrule, where women could poke fun at men, mock authority, or join in bawdy songs without fear of reprisal. For a brief moment, hierarchies bent, and women claimed a louder voice in the social chorus. These freedoms were temporary, of course. Once the festival ended, daily duties and social expectations resumed. But the memories lingered. Songs sung, dances shared, and glances exchanged offered women, especially the young, a sense of participation in shaping their own social paths. In this way, festivals acted as social valves, releasing the pressures of hierarchy and gender roles. For women, they were not escapes from reality, but reminders that beneath the weight of duty, there was also joy, choice, and the possibility of change, however fleeting. While music and dancing filled the air, another heartbeat of medieval festivals was the market. Stalls lined the village green or town square, brimming with goods that turned a festival into an economic engine. And here, too, women played indispensable roles, not only as buyers, but as sellers, crafters, and entrepreneurs in their own right. Many women prepared weeks in advance, setting aside goods to sell at fairs. Peasant women brought baskets of eggs, butter, cheese, and honey, products of household labour that could fetch a good price during festivities. Others sold baked treats, spiced buns, fruit tarts, or fried pastries that tempted festival-goers with their smell alone. Brewing, one of the most traditional women's crafts, also provided a reliable source of income. Alewives often set up makeshift taverns, serving foaming mugs of drink to travellers and villagers alike. Craftswomen also made their mark. Spinners and weavers sold cloth and garments, often dyed in bright colours that stood out among the grey of daily clothing. Needleworkers sold embroidered handkerchiefs, belts, or decorative headscarves. Herbalists and midwives displayed bunches of dried plants, offering remedies for aches, fevers, or charms for good luck. In some towns, women were even licensed to sell goods at fairs, reflecting that their presence in the marketplace was not marginal but expected. Festivals gave women a rare chance to earn their own money outside the household, while men often dominated larger trades like livestock or ironwork. Women controlled smaller, everyday items essential for the community. For poorer families, the coins a woman earned at the festival could be crucial, helping pay rents, tithes, or buy tools for the winter ahead. For some, the festival stall was the beginning of something larger, a reputation as a skilled brewer, baker, or cloth maker that might lead to steady customers. But commerce at festivals was also social. Women's stalls became gathering points where gossip was exchanged, alliances formed, and friendships deepened. Bargaining was often as much performance as transaction, with women confidently setting prices, teasing customers, and showing shrewd business sense. These interactions gave them a voice in the economic and social life of the community, one that was harder to ignore amid the laughter and bargaining of the market square. In the bustling world of festival markets, women proved themselves not only as keepers of the hearth, but as vital contributors to the broader economy. Their stalls, crafts, and goods transformed celebrations into thriving marketplaces, where coins clinked as loudly as church bells, and women's labour was seen, heard, and valued. As the music faded and festival fires dimmed, what endured was more than fleeting merriment. Women's contributions to medieval festivals left a legacy that echoed in community memory, local traditions, and cultural identity. These gatherings were not simply diversions, they were vital expressions of communal life, and women stood at their centre. Their work in food preparation alone ensured survival through feast and famine. The loaves baked, the ales brewed, and the stews ladled during celebrations reflected knowledge passed down through generations of women. These recipes and methods became part of communal identity, linking each festival to the next. Even today, many traditional European festival foods trace their roots to women's kitchens of the Middle Ages. Ritual roles, too, created legacies. The May Queens crowned with flowers, and Harvest Queens adorned with grain embodied ideals of fertility and renewal. Though symbolic, their presence reinforced the vital association between women and the cycles of nature. In some villages, echoes of these practices still survive in folk traditions where young women lead dances, crown garlands, or carry the first fruits of harvest into the village square. In the realm of music and storytelling, women ensured cultural continuity. Their songs preserved collective memory, while their folk tales reinforced values, humour, and warnings that guided community behaviour. These oral traditions outlasted any single festival, surviving even when wars or plagues disrupted village life. Without women's voices, many of these stories would have been lost to silence. Economically, women's market roles planted the seeds of independence. The coins they earned at festival stalls gave them a measure of autonomy, however small, and proved their indispensable place in the village economy. This economic visibility challenged the notion that women's labour was confined to the hearth. Their stalls and crafts were statements of presence in the public sphere, an early form of agency in societies that often limited their voice. Perhaps most importantly, festivals gave women spaces of freedom, however brief. The dances, songs, and social games allowed them to express joy, choose partners, or mock authority in ways daily life forbade. These moments, though temporary, revealed possibilities of agency and choice, planting seeds for cultural memories of women not as silent workers, but as vital contributors to community joy and identity. The legacy of women in medieval festivals, then, is not just about what they did. It's about how their presence transformed celebrations into living, breathing reflections of community. Without their hands, voices, and spirit, medieval festivals would have been hollow shells. With them, they became enduring symbols of survival, continuity, and shared humanity. To imagine a medieval woman setting out on pilgrimage is to imagine a life suddenly broken free of its usual boundaries. In an age when most women rarely travelled farther than the next village market, taking to the open road was nothing short of radical. Yet thousands of women did just that, strapping on shoes, lifting walking staves, and stepping onto paths that led to Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or even Rome itself. The act of departure was as symbolic as the destination. Leaving one's home meant leaving behind fields, hearth, and the expectations of daily labour. For married women, this sometimes required permission from husbands, while widows and unmarried women often had more freedom to go. The pilgrimage was both a religious duty and a personal gamble, for travel was dangerous. Roads were plagued by bandits, disease, and harsh weather, and women travellers were especially vulnerable. But the risks themselves made the act more meaningful. To walk away from safety was to embody devotion, to show God that no hardship would stand in the way of faith. Not all pilgrims were noblewomen wrapped in cloaks of fine wool. Many were poor peasant women, clutching wooden crosses or wearing badges stitched into their clothing as proof of their vows. Some carried tokens of their intentions, a rosary, a candle to be offered at a shrine, or the name of a loved one whispered in prayer. They walked not for sightseeing, but for salvation, seeking penance for sins, healing for bodies, or hope for souls. Every mile trodden was believed to lighten the weight of earthly burdens. At departure, communities often marked the moment with prayer or blessing. A priest might sprinkle holy water, or neighbours might gift food for the road. Women pilgrims left not just as individuals, but as representatives of families and villages. Their journey was communal in spirit. When a woman walked, she carried the grief of a sick child, the sins of a husband, or the fears of an entire household on her shoulders. Thus, the first step was more than physical. It was spiritual defiance against the confines of ordinary life. To become a pilgrim was to embrace uncertainty, to trust in divine protection, and to hope that at the end of the long road, healing or redemption awaited. For women of the Middle Ages, the pilgrimage was both escape and devotion, a path carved through hardship toward holiness. Every pilgrimage began not with the first step, but with an inner stirring, a motive of the heart. For medieval women, those motives were as varied as their lives, yet all were bound by faith and the hope of transformation. One of the most common reasons was healing. In a world where medicine was rudimentary and illness could ravage entire families, shrines were seen as gateways to miracles. A mother might walk hundreds of miles to lay a child's name before the relics of a saint. A woman weakened by chronic pain might travel with the hope of bathing in a holy spring or touching a reliquary believed to cure disease. Healing was never guaranteed, but belief itself carried its own power, offering women hope when all else failed. Another powerful motive was penance. For sins confessed, priests sometimes assigned pilgrimage as a living form of repentance. Instead of reciting prayers in the safety of home, women were told to journey outward, to feel the weight of miles as a mirror of spiritual struggle. Some walked barefoot as a sign of humility. Others wore simple garments to mark their devotion. To endure hardship willingly was to show God the sincerity of one's repentance. There were also vows and promises, often born in moments of desperation. A woman facing childbirth might swear to walk to a shrine if her life and her child's were spared. A widow mourning her husband might pledge to visit a saint's tomb to honour his soul. Pilgrimage became a contract between human weakness and divine mercy, a way of binding heaven and earth through movement and sacrifice. For others, the motive was renewal. Pilgrimage offered a rare chance to step outside the strict boundaries of village life, to breathe a different air, to see other faces. For women whose days were measured by chores, markets, and endless duty, the road itself became a kind of freedom. The act of walking among strangers, joining processions, and hearing chants in new languages expanded their world, and in turn, their faith. In every case, pilgrimage was more than travel. It was an act of longing. Whether for healing, forgiveness, or a glimpse of life beyond the familiar, women walked with hearts heavy yet hopeful. Their motives revealed the depth of their devotion, turning each journey into a moving prayer, stitched mile by mile into the fabric of the medieval landscape. For female pilgrims, the journey itself was as important as the destination. Medieval pilgrimage routes spanned entire continents, carving paths that connected small villages to the greatest holy shrines of Europe. These roads, dusty in summer, treacherous in winter, were the veins of faith, and women walked them with determination, often in groups for safety. The Camino de Santiago in Spain was one of the most famous routes. It drew thousands of travellers from across Europe, all converging on the shrine of St. James in Compostela. Women, young and old, were among them, carrying simple bundles of bread and water, sometimes with children in tow. In England, Canterbury became a magnet for those seeking healing at the tomb of Thomas Becket, a saint whose martyrdom electrified medieval devotion. For others, the greatest prize was Rome itself, the heart of Christendom, where pilgrims could pray at the tombs of St. Peter and St. Paul. These journeys could take months, even years. Women walked alongside knights, peasants, monks, and merchants, their presence both ordinary and extraordinary. Some rode donkeys or carts if wealth allowed, but most trudged on foot, battling blisters, exhaustion, and hunger. Inns and monasteries dotted the routes, offering shelter but not always safety. Bandits preyed on pilgrims, and for women, the danger of harassment or assault was a constant shadow. Travelling in groups was vital, and women often bonded together, forming sisterhoods of the road where shared songs and prayers created strength. Yet the hardships also forged resilience. Pilgrims marked their progress with rituals, kissing roadside crosses, lighting candles at chapels, or bathing in sacred springs. Each act reminded them that every mile brought them closer to holiness. Badges and tokens, like scallop shells for Santiago or lead medallions from Canterbury, served both as souvenirs and proof of their devotion, carried proudly by women when they finally returned home. For many, the road was transformative in itself. Women who had never left their villages suddenly found themselves walking through foreign lands, hearing new dialects, and meeting strangers from distant kingdoms. Pilgrimage expanded horizons, turning ordinary women into travellers in the truest sense. The long roads to holy shrines were grueling, but they were also spiritual classrooms. Each blister was a lesson in endurance, each mile a prayer in motion. For women, the journey itself became a form of worship, a living testament that faith could move feet as well as hearts. The idea of a holy pilgrimage may conjure images of prayerful walks under sunny skies, but the reality for female pilgrims was far harsher. The roads of medieval Europe were fraught with danger, and every step carried risks that could test not only a woman's body, but her faith. Bandits and thieves haunted the major routes. Pilgrims often carried coins or small valuables to offer at shrines, making them tempting targets. Women were especially vulnerable, travelling with fewer means to defend themselves. Some disguised themselves in plain masculine clothing, hoping to avoid unwanted attention. Others clung tightly to groups of fellow pilgrims, knowing that safety often lay in numbers. Illness was another constant threat. Long days of walking left feet blistered and bodies weary, while exposure to cold rains or blazing sun could bring fever or exhaustion. The crowded inns and hostels where pilgrims slept often spread diseases quickly, and outbreaks could decimate groups on the road. For women already burdened with caring for children or elderly companions, sickness turned the pilgrimage into an even heavier trial. Food and water were unreliable. Some days offered warm meals at monasteries or village kitchens. Others forced pilgrims to survive on stale bread, nuts, or what could be foraged along the roadside. Women bore the task of stretching rations, nursing hungry companions, and keeping spirits high. Their resilience often meant the difference between pressing forward or turning back. And then there was the social danger. Not all pilgrims were holy in spirit. Among the throngs were opportunists, gamblers, and those seeking pleasure rather than penance. Female pilgrims could find themselves harassed or judged harshly by others. Rumours sometimes spread that women who travelled too freely must be morally suspect. In such a climate, every step carried the double burden of both physical and reputational risk. Despite all this, women pressed on. Hardships were reframed as sacrifices, the road itself seen as a penance that mirrored Christ's suffering. Each danger endured was transformed into a kind of spiritual currency, proof of devotion. To collapse from exhaustion or suffer harassment was painful, but to persevere through it was to strengthen one's soul. For female pilgrims, the dangers of the road were not deterrents. They were the very essence of pilgrimage. Hardship was both the price and the path, and those who endured could claim not just to have reached a shrine, but to have lived their faith mile by mile. While the pilgrimage road was marked by danger, it was also rich with companionship. For female pilgrims, travelling in groups was not just practical, it was essential. Safety, encouragement, and shared devotion wove bonds of sisterhood that turned lonely roads into moving communities of faith. Most women rarely travelled alone. They set out with family members, neighbours, or fellow parishioners, forming bands of pilgrims whose shared purpose created solidarity. Widows might band together, pooling resources and watching over one another. Young maidens often walked under the guidance of older women who provided both protection and example. Along the way, these groups grew, merging with travellers from other villages, until entire processions snaked across the countryside, banners raised and songs carried on the wind. Within these groups, women found unique opportunities for connection. They prayed together at roadside crosses, shared bread and water, and tended to the blisters and fevers that inevitably came. A mother might help not only her own children, but also those of another pilgrim, creating temporary families bound by circumstance. In this way, women's traditional roles as nurturers and caregivers extended to the road, but they also gained support in return. The sisterhood of pilgrimage was reciprocal, comfort given, comfort received. These bonds also brought joy. Long days of walking were lightened by songs, stories, and laughter. Women swapped folk tales from their villages, sang hymns in harmony, and even joked about the hardships they faced. The pilgrimage became more than penance. It became a school of friendship, where bonds formed under duress often lasted a lifetime. Returning home, women sometimes maintained contact with those they had met on the road, strengthening ties between distant communities. At holy shrines, this sisterhood became most visible. Women knelt side by side at altars, lit candles together, and shared in the awe of reaching their goal. For many, the journey forged spiritual kinship that transcended bloodlines or class. A peasant woman could find herself shoulder to shoulder with a noble lady, both humbled before the relic of a saint. Pilgrimage, in this way, temporarily flattened hierarchies and created a sense of unity among women of all walks of life. Companionship on the pilgrimage road was not simply about surviving dangers, it was about transforming the journey into something larger than individual faith. Through sisterhood, women found strength, joy, and solidarity, proving that even in hardship, community could flourish on the long road to holiness. For female pilgrims, reaching a holy shrine was the climax of the journey, the moment when hardship gave way to awe. After weeks or even months on the road, the sight of cathedral spires piercing the horizon, or the glow of candles at a saint's tomb, must have brought tears to many eyes. These encounters were not simply destinations, they were transformative experiences, reshaping the faith and identity of those who arrived. At Santiago de Compostela, women joined the throngs pressing into the cathedral to embrace the statue of St. James and lay their burdens before the apostle. They lit candles, offered coins, or left personal tokens, a lock of hair, a garment from a sick loved one, as tangible prayers. In Canterbury, they knelt at the shrine of Thomas Becket, whose blood spilled in martyrdom was believed to heal the sick. Women bathed in holy springs, touched relics, and prayed with fervour, hoping that each act of devotion might bring healing, forgiveness, or renewal. The rituals were often sensory and overwhelming. Bells rang, incense filled the air, and chants echoed from the choir stalls. For women accustomed to the plainness of village chapels, these great shrines dazzled. Here, they could feel part of something vast, a Christendom that stretched far beyond their fields and cottages. To participate in the grandeur of the shrine, was to experience the universal church, with women fully included as worshippers and witnesses. Yet encounters at shrines were not only about individual devotion, they were social events. Pilgrims from across Europe mingled in the same sacred space, exchanging stories of their journeys. Women from distant lands compared tokens, swapped recipes, or traded small gifts. These meetings turned shrines into crossroads where culture, language, and faith intertwined. For many women, this was the first time they encountered people from so many backgrounds, and it broadened their understanding of the world. Importantly, shrines also offered spaces where women could assert agency. Some took on leadership roles, organising group prayers or caring for weaker companions at the altar. Others brought back holy water, blessed tokens, or indulgences to their villages, becoming carriers of spiritual power. By bringing the shrine home in physical or symbolic form, women became mediators of holiness for their communities. Encounters at shrines crowned the pilgrimage with meaning. The relics touched, the prayers whispered, and the candles lit were not the end of the journey. They were its transformation. For women pilgrims, these sacred encounters validated every mile endured and turned the hardships of the road into blessings of the spirit. Though countless women set out on pilgrimages anonymously, history has preserved the stories of a few whose journeys became legendary. Their accounts give us rare glimpses into the courage, faith, and resilience that female pilgrims embodied. One of the earliest and most remarkable was Egeria, a noblewoman from the late 4th century. She journeyed all the way from Western Europe to the Holy Land, travelling across mountains and deserts to visit biblical sites. Her detailed letters, preserved by monks, describe not only the places she visited, but also the liturgies, prayers, and customs of early Christianity. Egeria's writings remain one of the most important sources for historians, proving that women could be both devout pilgrims and keen observers of the wider world. Centuries later, Margery Kempe of England became another unforgettable figure. A mother of 14 and often criticised as eccentric, Margery felt called to a life of devotion. She undertook multiple pilgrimages in the 15th century, travelling to Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Rome, and even the Holy Land. Her emotional style of prayer, often involving weeping and ecstatic visions, made her controversial. Yet her Book of Margery Kempe is considered the first autobiography in English. Through her, we see how pilgrimage could transform a laywoman into a voice of spiritual authority. Royal and noble women also walked these roads. Queens and countesses travelled to shrines to seek fertility blessings, pray for victories, or atone for political actions. Their journeys were often recorded in chronicles, emphasising their piety as well as their influence. For example, Eleanor of Aquitaine famously undertook the Second Crusade alongside her husband, Louis VII, in the 12th century. Though her pilgrimage had political and military dimensions, it still reflected the idea that women, even of the highest rank, sought redemption and meaning through sacred travel. But not all famous female pilgrims were noble or visionary. Some were remembered in miracle collections. Simple women healed at shrines, widows protected on dangerous roads, or mothers whose prayers for their children were answered. Their stories, though less grand, were preserved by the Church as proof of divine intervention, placing ordinary women alongside saints in the spiritual record. These famous figures remind us that female pilgrimage was never marginal. Women were chroniclers, visionaries, leaders, and examples of devotion. Their journeys inspired others, proving that the act of walking in faith was open not only to monks and knights, but to women of every station, from queens to village mothers. For female pilgrims, the end of the journey was not simply the walk back to their village. It was the transformation of everything that followed. Returning home meant carrying the weight of the pilgrimage into daily life, and women often became storytellers, teachers, and symbols of devotion for their communities. One of the first tasks was to share tangible proof of the journey. Pilgrimage badges, like the scallop shell from Santiago de Compostela or a lead medallion from Canterbury, were proudly displayed. Women wore them on cloaks, hats, or belts, silent yet powerful tokens that said, "I walked the road, I saw the shrine, I prayed at the tomb." Some brought back holy water, oil from lamps, or relics blessed at the shrine, which they distributed among family and neighbours. These sacred souvenirs extended the power of the pilgrimage beyond the individual, becoming a blessing for entire households. But perhaps even more important than relics were the stories. Around hearth fires or during communal gatherings, women recounted their adventures, the hardships of the road, the kindness of strangers, the grandeur of cathedrals, and the miracles they had witnessed. For communities where most people would never leave the village, these tales were windows into a wider world. Female pilgrims became unofficial chroniclers, their voices weaving together faith, folklore, and first-hand experience. Some women returned transformed in reputation as well as faith. A peasant woman who had walked to Canterbury might gain new respect as a figure of piety. A widow who completed the Camino de Santiago could be seen as a living witness to perseverance. In some cases, women became informal spiritual leaders, sought out for advice or healing prayers because of the holiness associated with their journey. Yet reintegration was not always easy. Some women faced skepticism. Were their travels truly holy, or had they been an excuse for freedom? Marjorie Kempe, for example, often faced ridicule upon her return, her emotional expressions of faith misunderstood by her neighbours. Still, the courage to take the road and return marked women in ways that could not be undone. Ultimately, returning home meant stitching the extraordinary back into the ordinary. Pilgrimage did not end at the shrine. It continued in the sharing of blessings, in the retelling of stories, and in the subtle ways women reshaped their communities with the spiritual strength they had gained. In this way, their footsteps lingered long after the journey was over. Though centuries have passed, the footsteps of medieval women pilgrims still echo across Europe's holy roads. Their journeys, once risky acts of faith, left legacies that shaped not only their own communities, but also the broader culture of pilgrimage. Women's stories, whether recorded in chronicles, miracle collections, or in the fading memories of villages, testify that they were never silent participants, but vital threads in the fabric of medieval devotion. One legacy lies in the democratization of pilgrimage. Female pilgrims proved that the sacred road was not only for monks, knights, or clerics, but also for wives, mothers, widows, and maidens. Their presence reminded society that holiness could be pursued by all, regardless of gender or status. This inclusivity strengthened the idea of pilgrimage as a communal act, a shared path of faith that bound men and women together before God. Another enduring impact was cultural transmission. Women carried home not just relics and badges, but also songs, prayers, and stories gathered from distant lands. Through their voices, new devotions and rituals spread into villages. A woman who had prayed at Canterbury might introduce her neighbours to the cult of Thomas Becket. Another returning from Rome could recount marvels of the eternal city, inspiring others to undertake journeys of their own. In this way, women became conduits of spiritual exchange, expanding horizons for communities that otherwise rarely looked beyond their parish boundaries. The legacy was also personal. For many women, pilgrimage reshaped identity. A peasant woman who had braved the Camino de Santiago might return with newfound confidence, her status elevated by endurance and piety. Noble women who sponsored or undertook journeys cemented reputations for religious devotion, often remembered in family chronicles or monastic records. Even when skepticism greeted them, as in the case of Marjorie Kempe, women pilgrims carved out spiritual authority by sheer determination. Finally, their legacy endures in the very idea of movement as devotion. By stepping onto the road, women embodied faith in action, showing that holiness was not confined to cloisters or chapels, but could be lived in the dust, danger, and fellowship of the journey itself. Their courage paved the way for future generations, reminding us that the search for meaning often begins with the willingness to walk. The legacy of female pilgrims is thus not measured in the distance of their journeys, but in the way their devotion reshaped communities, broadened horizons, and left lasting footprints on the spiritual landscapes of Europe.